All right, everybody coming in slowly. I like that. The first 31 are in. Here we go, guys. Just make sure you keep the camera off, please, and the microphone on mute because we don't want to get interrupted with that conversation. I see a lot of familiar faces, which I like. Yeah, Nicholas Bennett is right there. I know Lane Evans is somewhere here. My friend Lane, Michael Bow. Nice, nice from all over the world. So, all right, whoever joined already, guys, thank you for coming and dedicating your time to education. So for me, this is one of the reasons why I started Tennis House. I am not a rich person, I can tell you that, and I don't have money to give away. So the only thing that I can do is share, right? So I build a platform which reaches over 100,000 people, and with so much reach, you have a little obligation to give back. And I do that with love because I love our sport, tennis, and it's growing. And yeah, we need to do everything we can to grow our sport. It's not doing it alone, and that's why I want to thank Mark so much for doing that, being here today with us. And I wanted to thank quickly as well all the other guys I had, like a Dusan Laovic, Damit Zumor, Laszlo Jerry, Mary Pierce, Emilio Sanchez, Mark Philippoussis, all those guys. They don't have to be with Tennis House on one of those calls or lives. They do that because they love the sport, and that's why our sport is still alive, because of people like Mark and of people like all the presenters I just named. So Dr. Mark Kovacs, it's an honor to have you again today here. And today we talk about the serve.
Wonderful. Thank you, Davor. Thanks for everything you're doing as well. And really excited to be here. And I think we're going to have some fun. So I'm going to share some stuff originally for the first, say, 15 minutes, little PowerPoint presentation just to get people thinking. And then also Davor sent me one of his players. So we're going to break down his serve and take a look at it practically. And then we should leave about 30 to 40 minutes to answer people's questions. So as we go along, use this time just to really think about what questions you want to ask, what things that you think are going to be relevant. So I'm going to start with a few slides here. Hopefully you can see my screen. So always like asking questions as part of a presentation. It's not just about presenting information, but it's about getting you all to think. So what's the number one reason for why there are so many poor servers around the world? What would be your answer to that? Write it down, put it in your mind, think about it. So we did quite a bit of analysis over the last decade, trying to kind of rank order what were the most common coaching cues that were probably misunderstood or misspoken. And this was from some really good coaches that had just heard it from their coach and they just said the same words and without necessarily fully understanding what it meant. So this was the number one phrase that came up, was one of the big misconceptions. Push your front hip out into the court. How many people have said that? How many people have coached that? That used to be a very common phrase in the 80s and 90s especially. Because you would see servers like Pete Sampras or Goran Ivanisevic that had that front hip would be way out inside the baseline, which is correct. The problem is how they got there. They got there the right way. How most people do it when they say stick your front hip out is they overload their front leg without any back leg load. So this is one of those sayings where the outcome that you're trying to achieve is potentially correct, but how most players do it is incorrect. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So here's another phrase that you want to think about. This is one that comes up all the time that people use that is counterproductive in many ways. Bend your knees. And why? Because just about every athlete I've ever seen on the tennis court serving bends their knees plenty. Most of the time they overbend their knees, meaning that they bend too deep and they get stuck at the bottom and they dissipate energy and they don't come out of their knee bend quick enough to optimize their loading mechanics into releasing that energy. So when we're talking about competitive players here, I'm not talking about a 2-0 beginner who may just throw the ball up and hit it. I'm talking about competitive players. typically telling them to bend their knees is not a great coaching cue. That's usually not their issue. Their issue is not so much bending of the knee, it's getting out of the bottom quicker and not waiting or getting stuck at the bottom as much. The third one that we'll discuss, serve like you throw a ball. So why this one's really, really important. The tennis serve doesn't have a lot of specifics to throwing. It's very, very different. It's an overhand action, but the mechanics of how you load your legs, how you release your arm, how you rotate with a throw, you actually come across your body and release. So your shoulders and your hips are facing the net at release. Whereas on the serve, you want to be side on still at contact on the serve. So not saying throwing is bad to do, but using a cue like serve like you throw a ball is not correct. When we throw, we have to adjust how we throw. And we do a lot of throwing drills. So it's not saying that throwing's bad, don't misinterpret it. But when you're coaching it, don't tell them to serve like they throw, because that's going to force them to over rotate and open up way too early. So important one to remember there. So again, a lot of this stuff has come from a lot of the research that we've done. There's quite a few research studies. So if people are interested in getting into the details of the research, just shoot me an email at kovacsinstitute.com and I'm happy to send you the biomechanical studies that we've done on this. It's very anatomical. It's kind of complex. So if you're not used to that language, these may not be the best papers for you. We've also done a lot of coach specific ones and parent specific ones that are a little bit easier to understand. We've taken a lot of the anatomical terms out and tried to make it more coach language. But if you are interested in that stuff, I'm happy to send you as much info as we have on that. So this is the 8 stages. So just so you understand what we're talking about, there's the start, the release, the loading, cocking, acceleration, contact, deceleration, and finish. And I want to thank Warren Pretorius and Tennis Analytics for taking these photos. Worked with him for many, many years, and he's in the photo pit at a lot of the big tournaments. So it's great to get these photos in the sequence that we need, so we can actually look at it and break it down. So we do this with every athlete. We break down their serve from the front and from the side usually. Some of them will go overhead as well. We'll use a drone so we can see shoulder and hip turn. But again, the purpose here, and we don't have enough time to go through this in a lot of detail, but just to be aware of where those 8 stages are. Hopefully this gives you a good visual of that. The kinetic chain concept, if you've heard me talk, I base a lot of what we do around how do we utilize the chain efficiently and effectively. Because the chain's going to work. It's going to do what it needs to do. We're going to hit the tennis ball. Every tennis player finds a way to put racket on ball. The good ones do it efficiently. The bad ones do it inefficiently, meaning that they use the wrong body parts at the wrong time. Their kinetic chain isn't synced, meaning that their lower body doesn't load first and then transitions the energy up into the upper body and out into the ball. So there's a disconnect there, and that's where you lose power. And that's also potentially where you can increase your injury risk, because your upper body and your core will jump ahead of your legs many times and do more work than it can actually handle to generate power. And you can do that for a short period of time, months, a lot of the time, but over time, something will break down if you're in the wrong order and your sinking's not right. So it's really a sequence of ankle, hip, core, shoulder, elbow, wrist out into the ball, and making sure that you have that timing right. And that's why the 8 stages is so valuable, because you can use the serve checklist to make sure the athletes are in the right positions throughout their motion and making sure that their sequencing is correct. So here's just an example. In our lab, we look at a lot of the athletes and we try to get these metrics. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at flexion and abduction. And I won't get into too much of the terms, but basically we're looking at hip turn, we're looking at back leg loading, we're looking at what happens at the thorax or the trunk, and how they use their lower body. Not as concerned about the upper body. Initially, we have to make sure our lower body is done correctly, because the upper body takes care of itself if the efficiency of your energy transfer is correct and the athlete doesn't have any major physical limitations in the upper body. which many of them do. They have restrictions, they have tightness. We talked about this a little bit in the fitness discussion yesterday. But again, we want to make sure you understand the lower body of the serve mechanics. And do they get a good hip turn? Do they come out of their legs appropriately? And have they loaded at the right time and transferred their energy at the right time? So here's an example of someone that many of you may see at your club. You know, an older player has had some surgeries, have some limitations. Here's an example of a lot of things that we see that are incorrect. You know, meaning that their back leg isn't loaded well, they've over rotated. This is stage 3 of the serve, just so folks know sort of what we're looking at. Loading position, some people call it trophy position. But no, notice how the elbow's low, the racket strings are open. Again, not worried about the lower body. The reason the lower body is doing that is because they've over rotated their hips and they haven't been able to load effectively. So now they have to make those adjustments in the upper body just to make contact. Then you've got a professional player here, you know, at the same position, and we can obviously see it looks a lot better. Legs are loaded perfectly, hips are turned. We've got our elbow and shoulder positions are on plane. Racket is in the right spot. So I think most people would say that's a pretty good, solid, loaded position. And again, we're looking at two very different people. One has major physical limitations, one doesn't. One's a professional tennis player, one's a senior tennis player. So you can't necessarily compare them and say, I want that senior to look exactly like this pro. It's unfair to expect that many times. So here's just a couple things. If you do have back leg loading issues, which we talk about a lot, do basic exercises. You don't have to do anything fancy. You do basic exercises. You know, so exercise 1 on the left is literally a jump with the turn with a bit of resistance. But again, it's making sure they load and they can push off. And then the exercise 2 here is making sure that they can load that single leg and push out of it. As you can see, you know, this is a left-handed player example here I'm showing. The back leg is the left leg. And they want to be able to jump out of that loaded position. If you look at the single leg movement, it's about the distance that you're going to bend your knees on a serve. You don't have to go much lower than that. It's really important to recognize that. You don't want to go too deep in the knee bend. So here's a good resource. If you go to the kovacsacademy.com site, go to the blog there. There's a whole series on drills you can do to improve back leg serving. And this is an example of a single leg back leg serve where the athlete actually starts at the base on their back leg and then they explode out of there. That's really important drill for your more competitive players to be able to come out of the load effectively. And too many players really struggle with that. So if you go to the Academy site and go into the blog and you can type in through the search box, just do back leg serving. And there's quite a few articles and videos and drills on that. Then the Tennis Serve Specialist program that we do, that's our really robust program. It goes into a lot more detail. We have a lot of different modules on all sorts of things, from the female serve to all the research studies. Our tennis serve research database we have over 100 published studies that we've collected. We haven't done them all. They're experts from all over the world that we have in our database, and we've put them into infographics and simple summaries for coaches to understand and trainers to understand in easier to recognize language. The serve checklist is one of the benefits of this program. This is how you go through the 8 stages, and each stage has 3 or 4 different things to look for. And then you just do your checklist to see, are they doing these right or wrong? And if they're doing them wrong, what do you need to work on? And it's 2 areas you focus on. One is technical. Can you make technical adjustments with cueing, with various drills that you just try to get them to do to make the change? But a lot of the time there's physical restrictions, meaning that their hips are tight, their shoulders are tight, they don't have good thoracic mobility, they can't get into those positions. So many times a coach will give a great coaching cue to a player, but 3 months later, the player hasn't improved that motion. And it's not the coach's fault most of the time. Most of the time it's the cue's right, the player physically can't do it. And you're just repeating the same drill, the same exercise, the same cue, and the athlete's not getting better at it because you haven't fixed the main problem, which is physically, they may not have enough range of motion in their back hip. They may not have enough strength in their glute. So you've got to work on those things, both from a physical standpoint, but as well as technical. So we go through each stage, kind of highlight what is good, what is the right positions, and then also what are the wrong positions. So again, it goes through here in a lot of detail with, hundreds of examples. I mean, again, we've been doing this for quite a long time now. So we have, hundreds of examples of good, hundreds of examples of bad, and also what makes the corrections, from pro players to juniors to adults to seniors. The style aspect of serving is overcoached, and the fundamentals are usually undercoached, meaning that too many times we focus in on stylistic aspects, and that's usually what most coaches will do. They'll say, hey, I like the look of Federer's serve, or I like the look of Isner's serve, and I want you to do X, Y, and Z to look like that. But if you actually look at all the great servers, they're all nearly identical in those 8 stages. They have some stylistic issues, but that's why you have to know the difference between coaching style versus coaching fundamentals. So as you can see here, contact is where the rubber meets the road. And there's a lot of different ways people end up hitting a tennis ball. You can kind of see all these different variations here. They all make contact with the ball, but there's an efficient way to do it and there's an inefficient way to do it. And you want to make sure you do the efficient way, which, you can see on the far left. That's the most efficient option. All those others we show have some inefficiencies there. Stage 7, long axis rotation and deceleration is, where the side of the racket that makes contact with the ball is facing the opposing side fence. You can see here, Steve Johnson and Andy Roddick do it as well as anyone. But then you see scenarios here on the right where players don't. They don't fully get that. Some people use the term pronation, which isn't incorrect, but it's not the whole motion. Pronation is at the forearm. It's this movement. And that's not completely what we're talking about here. It's actually much more of a shoulder motion. So the shoulder has to do majority of the work here, and then the forearm comes in and is involved. So pronation is not incorrect, but it's not the whole thing. It's only about 30-40% of the equation. You're missing 60 to 70% if you're not understanding how the shoulder functions throughout this motion. From contact, actually just before contact, you go from supination here through contact and then into pronation there. But the internal shoulder rotation is one of the most important aspects that needs to be effective from that standpoint. So hopefully that can kind of give you a sense of some of this stuff. And now I will take a couple questions. Let me just pull up this file of your player. But while I'm doing that, we can maybe answer a couple quick questions people have or anything you may have.
Yeah, let me guys, if you have any questions, write them in the chat box. And let me see. All right. Maz has one here. Hey, Davor, please ask Mark, what are the moves in tennis serve that a top level player can do, but a club level guy who does not do any physical conditioning should not do?
Yeah, great question. So that has a lot to do with how much rotation can they get in their hips, how well can they load their back leg and their back hip, which are the two big ones that if they're restricted there, it's going to limit what they do. Do they jump versus not jump? A lot of club players may not even jump. So you've got to recognize that. Assuming they can do all those, then it comes into the upper body and it's how far back can they get. If they're really restricted in their shoulder range of motion and their thoracic spine movement, they're not going to get into stage 4 cocking as well as a top player will. So you've got to recognize that. But everything else, there's no reason they can't make contact in an ideal position. Most players, unless they've had shoulder surgeries or something, should be able to get long axis rotation and be okay from that perspective. So, most things you can do at a club level unless you're really, really restricted, meaning you've had surgeries or something like that.
Mark, question for the cocking phase. So the racket is pointing down basically. So the knees, you start to push off, like you explode out of the knees, right? So the racket drops down.
Yeah. So the way you think about it is you've already exploded up from your legs.
Mhm.
You've transferred energy from storing in the lower body, and now you've released it into the upper body, and now your upper body is storing it. So cocking is the last stage that you store any energy in your body before you
Ah.
accelerate your arm out into the ball. So you have to have already released energy from your lower body up into your arm, because that's already later in the sequence. And a lot of club players, a lot of actually good players sometimes that don't have great serves, don't sync that right. And they're actually down in that position before they've already released energy. So they're getting stuck in that position.
So all the energy that you were pushing off into the ground and you coming off the ground, everything that you stored is in that moment, like
Correct.
right there down there.
Exactly. So
Mhm.
let's go through your player, because I think that'll help explain that. So I
Yeah.
think people can see this.
Here you go. Yeah.
So what we're looking at here, this is Davor was kind enough to send one of his players so we can sort of evaluate. I don't know if you want to give any background, Davor, on the level of this player.
Yeah, I mean, like at that time, he started to commit, and before, so I was working with him since he's like 9 already, but had him like once a week, twice a week, and then right there, I started to have him almost every day at that point, and so yeah, so we were experimenting with the serve, and yeah, always good to get some different eyes on it too. So we were working like what you're gonna see now is like a year ago, and then I'll show you later what we were working on with him.
So this was already a year ago. So Davor's made some adjustments already, but this is sort of early before a lot of the adjustments were made. So just to give you context. So if we're looking at stage 2 here, release, this is where the ball comes out of the hand. This is an important stage, because if you don't get the ball toss right, we know everything else is struggling. So best players in the world all release the ball very similar, meaning that it's about eye level to the top of the head. You have a small window there that the ball comes out of the hand. He does this great, so no issues there. And typically the arm is released in nearly all great servers sort of on a 45-degree angle, somewhere around 130 to 230 if you're using your clock reference. So from that perspective, that arm is in a really good release point. The reason being is it allows you to rotate your hips. It allows you to get a consistent ball toss in the spot you want. There's a lot of value to that. So that all looks good. So, if we're going, I'm not going to go through the full checklist, but quick checkpoints, that's a great start. So all good there. Now we get into load. So now we start seeing some things starting to break down a little bit. So when you see some things like this, you can see he's a pretty good athlete. You can see that, it's not going to probably take that much to make some adjustments, but there's a few little things you want to start looking at. One is, notice the feet are starting to slide around. From this back view, you don't want to see both calves. You really only want to see one, meaning that they're right in line if they bring the foot up like that, because as we can see here, notice where the hip is right here. The hip hasn't rotated at all. Ideally, you'd like the hip to be over to the left a little bit more. That would be the preference. That would be where you would prefer to see the hip. So there's no loading of the hip. He's loaded the legs, and that's where sometimes people get confused, because they see, hey, he's got good knee bend. He's going down, which he is, but he's not rotating. And that's only half the battle. You want to rotate. So that's why he needs to pull that foot back a little bit, the back foot, and turn those hips a little bit in this position. As a result, what's he doing? His spine angle now, this line here that's curved a bit, is pretty rounded. And that's a bit of a concern longer term from an injury risk standpoint. That's usually a sign of players that will end up having some lower back problems at some point, because they have to over rotate then just to come out of it. And pars fractures or stress reactions in the lower back in junior players is one of the biggest issues we see. And a lot of the time it's due to serving technique, and it's little things, because overall it's not that he has a bad motion. He's got a pretty good motion. He's just got some components here that need to be adjusted slightly. So those are the two biggest things here. Ball toss, the reason there it's a little high, which means that he gets stuck in the bottom a little long. So he could bring his toss down a little bit, which would mean he wouldn't get stuck as long. So it's chicken and the egg and how you want to coach that. Have had success both ways. I usually don't mention the ball toss. I usually mention knee bend, and that'll automatically lower the ball toss. If I say bend your knees less, but still explode out of it, that'll usually lower the ball toss. Some coaches like to say, hey, lower the ball toss, and that'll do a similar thing. So you've just got to pick and choose your language based on the player that you have. But the goal needs to be fundamentals. What are we trying to accomplish?
Mm-hmm.
So here we are in cocking stage. So we see a few things here. Notice here at this point, another in the checklist item is you don't want to see both calves. You want to only see one, and you want him to be side on at this point. And he's already opened up his hips.
Mm-hmm.
So the front part of his hips are pointing pretty much to the net already. And notice how his spine angle is falling to the left here. So you can see the energy just is going in the wrong position. Energy is going left. Ideally, you want to go into the court. The other thing we're noticing as a result, and this is something where coaches may misinterpret this, notice how his elbow isn't really pointed to the ball. All the good servers, their elbow at this point will be pointing straight up. It's sort of pointing out here somewhere. It's put out to the side. And then the racket should be pointing to this right heel. The tip of the racket should be pointing to that right heel. So if he was doing everything else right, and this was the position of his arm, that would lend me to believe that he had some restriction in his thoracic spine and or his shoulder. But because his body weight's going so far left, his spine angle's all wrong, I don't think it's probably physical. I think it's much more technical at this point, that he's just started in the wrong position a little bit and he's falling to the left. So you've got to address that. Once he gets more side on, odds are he's going to have a much better cocking position here. Shoulder and elbow positions are going to be aligned much better. But again, we don't know that unless we test him. But in general, just based on how it looks, that would be the guess. So as you can see here, notice how the spine and the head is really falling out wide here. Another cue for this is notice how the legs are so separate at this point. They usually don't start separating until you get to contact. He's separating really early at this point with the legs. It happened previous stage. And notice here that you see the elbow of the left hand. So that left arm, the non-dominant arm at this point should be tucked in and it should be side on. So a lot of you have heard the term shoulder over shoulder position. He doesn't have the shoulder over shoulder position here. The left shoulder's going that way. You know, the right shoulder's sort of going this way, but they're not aligned at all. So the efficiency isn't there. So again, you know, when we break it down like this, it sounds like he's got all these things to work on. He really doesn't, you know, because, you know, most of his motion's pretty good. So, you know, if we look at it frame by frame here, you know, and you look at it in this kind of environment without us stopping it, you would think, you know, that he's got a pretty good serve. You know, you look at it in this type of environment without breaking it all down, makes good contact. He's got really good long axis rotation there. So right here, notice how he makes contact, and, you know, he's going to have a really good serve because he's got that. That's hard to see with a lot of players. And then that's how he lands. So as you can see, if you go back here to here, this is where we need to make the adjustment, because everything else is a result of how this position looks. Once we fix this position, everything else gets better. But without that position being fixed, it's really hard to get in the right position. So notice here at contact, we've got a joint angle approximately 140 degrees of abduction, you know, and we always look at that angle of contact. You really don't want it much more than 125 degrees, because that means you're more arms straight overhead versus out to the side. And that puts a lot of strain on your shoulder. And that's where we see a lot of the shoulder problems, the back problems as a result of that, one of the results. But again, we don't fix that at contact. We have to work backwards and fix it at loading, stage 3. So we see the issues at stage 6 here at contact, but most of the problems are as a result of stage 3. But again, you know, just there you can see here, great long axis rotation. That's a really good sign. Just notice his spine angle though, how it's falling this way. So the body weight's falling to the left pretty significantly. And once you make that adjustment, you keep him side on longer, it's going to take care of a lot of that. So again, hopefully that sort of helped a little bit. Just go through the 8 stages really quickly. Again, you see this a lot with when you break it down, you pick up these fine pieces of info that you know you've got to adjust. But if you see it in full speed, the serve looks pretty good. I mean, if we, work through this in full speed, so from that standpoint.
Yep.
So I'll stop sharing now and we can turn it back over to some questions.
Yeah. Wait, Mark, can you hear me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let me, I just want to share my screen quickly. And I want to, let me see. You can see now, let me move this with the foot position.
Yep.
So as you said earlier, I tried to make him not slide too far around and keep the right leg a little bit closer to the heels of the left leg and try to work a little bit on the rotation.
Yep. I mean, you see the position on the right. There's much more rotation. Better load, better turn. Elbow position's really good as well. So you can see you've made some really good adjustments there.
So yeah, and I don't have a video from right now. So so I think, yeah, as you said, it's so important. That's why I'm so glad you're here and so many coaches joined. It's so important to know what to fix, right? Because we can do a lot of damage if the hips are not, if the legs are not in the right position. There's so much force on the hips, right? And if you do things wrong, then cannot be good sometimes. So let's go through a couple. Mark, first of all, thank you so much. That was amazing to see. That's why I like those webinars. This was very interactive in sense of we saw a serve, one of the best in his field, analyzed it. I think this is so priceless. So thank you for taking time and doing this, Mark. And yeah, let's go through a couple of questions. Do you have the chat thing on as well, Mark?
I do. Mm-hmm.
All right, if anything catches your attention, let me know. If not, I start. Do you hit the ball when the body is fully extended from the knee flexion?
At contact, yes. So your knees, so you're going to be fully extended in your lower body. Your trunk and upper body, there's going to be a slight break. You're not going to be completely straight from heels to head. There's going to be a slight break at your trunk, about a 20-degree, 15-degree break. So if you think of the lower body and your upper body like this, if that was straight, there's going to be a slight forward lean with your upper body to make contact because you're going into the court, but your lower body should be very straight. Yes, your knees should be fully extended there.
All right, the next one from Lynn. What about the continental grip with strong service? Do they move a little over to a hybrid Eastern continental grip when they go for a big flat first serve?
Yeah, so I've worked with a lot of some of the fastest servers ever, and they've all got slightly different grips. So it's not a standard that you have to have a traditional continental. You could have a slight Eastern backhand. You could have a slight, when I say slight, it's not a full, meaning that you haven't fully gone around, but it's adjusted slightly. They've got a slight Eastern forehand. Boris Becker was probably the most famous one that had more of an Eastern forehand grip on his serve, but there's a lot of players that shift a little bit, not as extreme as Boris had, but close to that. So it's kind of volley grips. I have the same discussion about what grip you should use to volley. It's similar. It depends a bit on what you're trying to do. Certain players will adjust a grip slightly if they're going to hit a kick serve versus a flat, or if they're going to hit a slice serve versus a flat. So you want to start your players always having sort of more of a traditional grip, but over time they're going to adjust it slightly. And unless it gets way out of whack, meaning it gets to a semi-Western type of forehand grip, you don't necessarily want to mess with it too much unless you've got a really good reason.
All right. The ball toss is very important. Hold on, here we go. Where was that? Very important. What about ball contact position regarding serving styles? Flat serve, kick, slice, and also if the player right-handed, what up with the left hand after the shot? What should the player keep his left hand by the end of the shot?
Yeah, so let me just answer the second part maybe first.
Yeah.
So the left arm, the non-dominant arm, if you're trying to utilize that, that's meant to stay on side on your body. So you're meant to keep that side on so you can have that shoulder over shoulder position. So that's really the biggest thing is it's a cue to help. You shouldn't have to coach that. If that's opening up and it's flying to the left when you're serving, it means they've over rotated. It means the hips have over rotated, the shoulders have over rotated, and the arms coming out as a result. It's not the cause though. You can cue them to keep their arm in. We do some different drills to help with that, but you've got to make sure you fix the reason why it's happening. So that's an important thing to remember.
All right. How important do you think the racket take back is? Do you favor a short take back straight up to the loading position, or a long take back where the racket drops down first?
Yep. So that's probably one of the biggest discussions coaches have, and I don't spend any time on that. Reason being is it's style. Look at all the great servers throughout history, and I can show you all those things you mentioned and them hitting great serves. Sampras had a different take back than Isner, that has a different take back than Serena Williams, that has a different take back than Sam Stosur. All got great serves. So that should tell us all that all these discussions about what's the best take back, we're focused on the wrong thing. Notice how we go from stage 2 to stage 3 in the serve. It goes from ball release to loading. There's no discussion around take back. Why? Because if you get to loading right, it didn't matter what your take back was. And every great server gets to loading correctly. So it's not saying you don't want to coach that. I'm just saying that's much more of a stylistic aspect of serving, what people prefer, what people like. There's a lot of coaches that are very adamant that they want all their players to have a certain take back. That's fine. That's the art of coaching and what a coach likes. But from a pure biomechanical fundamental, it doesn't matter what the take back is. And that has been shown out over time with how many different varieties of servers there are. But when you actually break down their serve, their fundamentals are the same. John McEnroe, his take back was unique. He had some of the most sound fundamentals you can see on the serve. Great hip turn, great stage 3, stage 4, stage 5, stage 6. So people look at his serve and say he had a weird foot position and a unique arm swing, like an elephant kind of trunk swing. But he got to loading perfectly.
All right. Mark, question about the pronation. Can you explain a little bit, because there's some misconceptions, where the strings face? Do the player hit the ball right this at the contact, or some people think they turn already? Like maybe you can.
Yeah, no. I mean, if people got to realize there's somewhere between 4 and 6 degrees only difference in racket head position for a flat serve versus a slice serve, meaning that a flat and a slice serve are nearly identical. It's the difference that's the difference at the racket at contact. So whether it's flat or slice, the mechanics of the motion are the same. You just have a slight variation at the racket head. And that's why, the great servers have such great disguise, because their motions are the same. But from a standpoint of full pronation, it happens where you see it, the contact of the ball has to be on the strings. It has to be pretty much in the, doesn't have to be smack in the middle of the strings. It can be top right, it can be top left, depending on what you're trying to hit, but it has to be square. You can't have your racket completely turned at contact. Otherwise, if that happened, the ball would go straight into the side fence. So you have to realize that it's very much straight on at contact. It just happens so fast, and the speed of that happens so quickly that if you're looking at it in real time, you're not going to pick any of that up. When you break it down, we do some analysis where we look at things in 1,000 frames a second. So you can break down the serve into, 1,000 frames. Serve's about a second, give or take, from release to when they land. So you can see 1,000 little frames per second.
Mark, with pronation, one more question about that pronation, because I see some coaches overstress that. I feel like, they teach that too much. Don't we have, when we throw a baseball, for example, I know you did a lot of baseball, don't we pronate automatically when we throw that baseball? And don't we have that automatically in?
You should never teach pronation from a standpoint of it's potentially increasing injury risk. because you're forcing them into a position that's not natural. Because what pronation is, or when people talk pronation, they're mainly talking about the end of the long axis rotation. That should happen naturally. And if it isn't, it means that something earlier in the motion isn't correct. The moment you get them side on, every server I've ever seen ends up pronating to make contact effectively and doing what you're talking about. If they're not side on and they've opened up, that's when they don't do it right. So we don't want to teach the end. If you're teaching the end, you're forcing the body into a position that they're consciously thinking about. And you shouldn't be thinking about that.
Thank you. That was because I heard that so often. I was so glad.
It's similar to landing as well. So many people will teach kicking the foot back on landing of the serve. And again, the reason that the foot kicks back is so that the athlete doesn't fall flat on their face. That's the only reason the leg kicks up. It's because they've had a good serve and their energy's going forward and their foot kicks back. If you're coaching that to help them improve their serve, you're missing a real big component of what the serve is. The ball's already gone once they've landed. It has nothing to do with the serve. It's an outcome. It's actually, that's why it's called the finish, because it's really the end of the motion, but it's really the first step in your next shot. It's getting you ready for your next shot, your ground stroke, or if you're going to come to the net. So just be smart about, are you teaching style or are you teaching fundamentals?
Love it, love it. Thank you so much, Mark. The back leg position on pinpoint serve and platform stance.
Yep. So they're different, of course. So, platform, you're going to have your feet separate the whole time and you're going to load into your back leg and push up predominantly out of your back leg. Whereas when pinpoint, you're going to slide or bring your back foot up and then you're going to push off. So there's one extra component to a pinpoint motion. So it's slightly different, but once they get to load stage 3, they look pretty much the same. So that's why, as long as they get to stage 3 and they're in the right spots, we're good. If they're not getting to stage 3 correctly, that's when people start adjusting. Okay, this person was a platform, let's try pinpoint, or they're pinpoint, let's try platform. That's fine to change it up, but ask yourself, why are you doing it? What are you trying to improve? And are they actually improving it? If they're not improving it, normally what they like and what they grow up with is probably their most natural option. It doesn't happen very often. Madison Keys was one that we changed from pinpoint to platform, but she had the strength, the stability, the technique to do it comfortably, and it was more natural. But most players, when you change them, a lot of the time, they end up having injuries down the road because it's not as natural for them, especially if they change later in their career.
Okay, nice. And then would you start kids off the bat from a platform serve, or would you distinguish again if you have kids who naturally can get into the pinpoint, you just let them do that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it has a little bit to do with what are we, and where do we start them serving from as well. If you start them serving from the baseline and they're small and short and it's hard for them to serve, you're going to see a different mechanics than if you start them on a 60-foot court, for example, because they're closer to the net, they're going to have more comfort in the motion. So you have to be smart about how you're teaching the serve at a young age. We want to teach an adult mechanic as young as possible. And there's a lot of debate about that. A lot of people will be going, let's just get the serve in for the first few years and then change them at some point. But that's really not the best way to teach. The best way to teach is teach them as close to perfect technique as young as possible, as long as they can understand instruction and they have enough coordination. The coordination is where the young players sometimes struggle. When the ball goes above their head, that's when everything falls apart because it's hard for them. Their head's so much bigger than their body at that age that sometimes they lose balance, they lose control. And that's where the coach needs to know who they're working with. Because you can't say, I'm going to teach every 6-year-old the same, because some 6-year-olds can pick that up great and some 10-year-olds can't. And so you have to be really wise at that age. I feel like that's the hardest age to coach the serve, between 6 and 10. Because you may have a fully developed cognitive system that can handle it and you can teach all the sound fundamentals and they get it. but then you have others that you're trying to teach the exact same person or same skills to a different person, and they're not getting it, and they won't probably get it for another year or two. So you've got to then be willing to adjust and shorten things up, shorter backswings, less hip turn, lower ball toss, all these factors to make it a bit easier for them.
Okay. I saw a question because I always like that high school, like what basics would you stress for a high school player who would like a consistent serve but won't have the time or opportunity to develop a great serve?
So great point. Shorten everything up normally, meaning that lower ball toss, shorten backswing, make sure they load their back hip, and then swing. That's it. I mean, that's it. It's short and compact, as few moving parts as possible. And there's no reason they can't have a proficient serve, even if, they only play twice a week. We get it. They don't spend the hours that a lot of other people will, but you can still have a very simple, compact, low risk serve. You may not hit your spots as well. You may not get as much power as some other people, but that's not the objective. The objective for someone that maybe plays at high school and does 2 other sports, your goal is to get them enjoying it, make sure they make a lot of serves, make sure they have fun with it, and they don't feel like it's a liability.
Okay. Mark, like throwing the football, how much does that, like when you have those footballs with the stabilizer in the back, that fly pretty even, how much does that help the kid, for example, develop a good motion?
Yeah, I mean, we do that nearly every day with the players, some form of throwing, but I won't usually throw straight. You always want to throw up. That's the big difference, is you want to throw up as high as you can. So we do a lot of drills where we'll throw from the baseline and try to land in our own service box. So that means it has to go straight up and basically straight down. You're working on throwing in all these different ways to work on those side-on positions. So you don't want to open up your shoulder too much or your hips too early. So, yeah, but the throwing drills are really good. You just got to understand what you're working on and what you're not working on as well. It's not just, hey, throw a bunch and you're going to magically have a good serve.
Yeah, and when they get older and they're stronger and you take a light medicine ball, for example, then you always go into the loading the back leg position and then you kind of throw it up.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so a whole series of different options and progressions with a 1 pound, 2 pound small ball that has some weight on it, and we'll do shot put serves with that. So there's a whole series of things there. I put some info there on the Tennis Serve Specialist program. You can see the modules there that we talk about, and then I'll also put a link to the back leg serving on the blog, so you guys can get some resources from that standpoint as well.
And everybody's going to get the email, the guys from yesterday and the guys from today, and everybody I had in the webinars before and in the future. You guys going to get all the info in the email. And as I said, Mark has all the exercises for every stage, for everything on his webpage. He's doing that. He's one of the best in the world and has it all stored on a nice hard drive. And you guys can get access to that. And as I said, there's so many components on the serve. I would definitely, Mark taught me so much. I read all his books, and the next step for me as well as a coach is going to be, I want to do your courses, Mark. Like, can you tell us about those 3 courses you have? Like it's what is ITP?
Yeah, the International Tennis Performance Association. So that's all the fitness side of things. So that goes through strength training, movement training, flexibility, mobility, fitness testing, periodization, nutrition, all planning, making sure that you know how to put all these together in programs. And that's, there's one aimed at tennis coaches, which is called the Tennis Performance Trainer Program. And then there's one aimed at athletic trainers, strength coaches, chiropractors, medical doctors, all the people that sort of have the medical or health fields. And that's called the Certified Tennis Performance Specialist. So I'll put the link up there as well. You can check that out. That's called the ITPA, International Tennis Performance Association.
What is the next stage? I saw 3 things. The one was the ITPA.
Yeah, so the Master Tennis Performance Specialist, that's a very high level program. So that's for all the national federations, head strength coach at the USTA, Tennis Australia. We had our meeting of our expert group like 3 days ago. Folks like Jez Green were on there, who works with Alex Zverev, Yutaka Nakamura, who works with Naomi Osaka. Different folks like that get together and we sort of network and talk through sort of things. So that's the level 3 program. And it's a whole lot of things for people that have been in the field for usually 10 years or more, and they're working with higher level competitive players predominantly. And it's an ability for everyone to share best practices and sort of educate each other, learn from each other.
That's amazing. And then you have a serve certification as well, right?
Yeah, and that's called the Tennis Serve Specialist, TSS. And I put a link up in the chat box so folks can check that out as well and see kind of all the modules there. If you're really looking to get better at the serve, there's a ton of great information there. And we keep adding to it as well because we do these follow-ups every few weeks where we'll get together as a group and we'll analyze servers. And it's a way for coaches and people to keep learning. And so it's a constant. So once you get through the program, you can come join those every time we have them for Q&A sessions and things like that.
Oh, wow. All right, guys, coming to an end time-wise. The last question, because I think it's important. I was reading on the bottom there. Under 12 a year. Let me just type this in. Under 12 kids training 3 hours per week. What percentage of time would they work on serving? I guess it's related to coaches don't teach the serve enough. So, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a great question. It depends a bit. If you're playing 3 hours a week, at the young ages, usually you'd like 20 to 30% at least of your time being spent with serving involved. If you're playing a set or 2 a week, that would be included in that. At the young ages, basket serving is important to learn a skill. But if they're only playing 3 hours a week, I wouldn't probably do that much basket serving. I would probably suggest they do some of that on their own at home, where if they can serve into a wall or serve into a backyard or into a net or something, because if they're only on court for 3 hours a week, to me at that age, there's a lot to work on, and you don't want to spend an hour of that week just hitting basket serves. Even though it's important and it's valuable, if they were playing 10 hours a week, then I would say, yeah, I'd love to have 2 or 3 hours a week of basket serving. But if they're only playing 3 hours a week, they got to work on volleys, on movement, on forehands, on backhands, on point play, on strategy, on all that stuff. So you have to be wise about how you set it up.
All right, guys, that was amazing. Mark, I can't thank you enough for doing it. You sent me a couple of links before, Mark. Send me whatever you still have, please, so I can shoot it and send it out tonight. All the people that sign up for the webinars from day one will get Mark's info. And I hope a lot of you, it was great. So I think it's the best thing you can do to come, to webinars, and it's so much info and so much to learn on the serve, especially. Take advantage of having someone like Mark, guys. The page is amazing. I've been on there. You find everything you will need. And if you're a player, take advantage of that, because this is scientific data. It's not YouTube or Instagram, like there are always on Instagram and YouTube good things and bad things. Here, you only get the scientific proven stuff and all the good things. So you can't go wrong with that. Yeah, Mark, thank you again. Feedback is always great here. Thank you very much. All the way from Malaysia. Thank you. It was great. All the information again. Thanks. So, Mark, you're the man.
Well, I appreciate you putting it on and all the effort, and thanks for all the folks that joined today as well, and look forward to keeping in touch with everyone as well.
Yeah. So you guys going to get all the info on Mark's stuff, and yeah, make sure you take advantage of that. Mark, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and thanks again for everything, Mark.
Awesome. Take care.